Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Andrew Penn. I'm a nurse practitioner and the co-founder of Open Nurses, one of the co-founders. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to our conversation with Dr. Dan Karlin. Dan Karlin is the Chief Medical Officer of Definium Therapeutics, which is until about 2 weeks ago was called MindMed. And he joined that company in February of 2021, following MindMed's acquisition of HealthMode, which is a company that he co-founded and led as CEO. Prior to HealthMode, he built and led clinical informatics and regulatory strategy for Pfizer's Digital Medicine Innovation Research Lab, and he also served as global clinical lead for psychiatry clinical compounds at Pfizer. He previously served as founder and chief medical officer at Karlin Health, which is a leading technology-enabled psychiatry and addiction practice. He's a strategic advisor to several pharmaceutical, biotech, and health technology companies, and is a founding advisor to the Digital Biomarkers Journal, co-founder and board chair of the Digital Medicine Society, and was on the committee for leadership for digital drug development tools at Critical Path Alzheimer's disease, MJFF, and mental health IT at the APA. He's board certified in psychiatry, addiction medicine, and clinical informatics, and is a fellow of the APA and American Society of Addiction Medicine, and assistant professor of psychiatry at Tufts University School of Medicine. He has degrees in neuroscience and behavior, his bachelor's, and clinical informatics, his master's, and did his MD at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. So without further ado, let me introduce Dan to our audience here. Hey, Dan, good to see you.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks so much for the intro.
Yeah, no, great to have you here. We always start off these conversations just sort of asking, psychedelics is such an interesting space because people get into this in such different ways. So it'd be great to hear what your experience was and how you got here.
Yeah, I mean, the intro sort of said it all, which is that I am a psychiatrist. I'd worked as a psychiatrist and taken care of patients, and worked in training at the Tufts residency program as well. And when I left Pfizer, where I'd been working on drug and digital development, I kind of dove headfirst into the digital measurement space, really out of an interest in psychiatry, but also I think in systemic illnesses generally. We've got these disease definitions and severity monitoring that's all phenomenological, right? It's fundamentally symptom based, and we're not great at either defining or measuring symptoms as a general rule. We tend to sort of gloss over things and combine them with words that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So the thought was that digital technology could enable us to measure and define behavioral outflow symptoms in a more precise way. Ultimately, that digital effort led to some interventional technology, but also measurement technology through a company called HealthMode, and HealthMode was ultimately acquired by MindMed, which was a good outcome for HealthMode, a good outcome for a bunch of the folks affiliated with that company. And for me, it took me from watching from the sidelines of the psychedelic renaissance, I guess we call it now, this sort of second wave of psychiatric psychedelic research, into the deep end rather quickly. So one day I was an outsider looking in and interested and curious and optimistic about the potential for it all. And the next day, more or less, I was in this chief medical officer seat and trying to quickly get my feet under me and figure out what the best path forward for us as a company was.
So when you're talking about sort of markers of illness, I think it's probably worth reminding people, especially in psychiatry, we're so used to subjective only markers of illness that we don't even think about there being other markers. We wouldn't ask if we were cardiologists, we wouldn't say, well, I kind of get the feeling the patient's doing better without having measured their blood pressure or their lipids, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds at this. I'm a little ambivalent about it. On the one hand, psychiatry certainly is sign and symptom based, right? We observe things about patients and we ask them how they feel, and that constitutes our ability to both categorize people into diagnoses if appropriate, or to assess progress or lack thereof or whatever. And in psychiatry, we tend to be pretty willing to admit that's the status of things. I actually think the state of affairs in, let's say, somatic systemic illness is not a whole hell of a lot better. So if you think about, say, cardiology, or example, congestive heart failure, for example, while arguably there are more precise measures, they tend to be pretty outflow related too. And at the end of the day, if someone's got dependent edema and it gets better, that means their heart failure is getting better at some level. And that sort of situation, yeah, you have BDNF and other measures, and you can put a probe on someone's chest and look at actual cardiac function, fine. But I'm not sure the state of affairs is all that much different. Blood pressure is defined by a single measurement that we often know isn't right. That when we measure it in the office, it probably doesn't represent what someone's at-home blood pressure is. So we both over and under represent hypertension. The disease definition keeps evolving, and that's based on observation and follow-up. And so while psychiatry does have maybe a unique difference, which is once we discover either a pathonomic, measurable, non-behavioral outflow, like, I don't know, spike and wave on an EEG that defines seizures, then seizures become neurological, not psychiatric. So we tend to give away our diseases once they have either a pathological finding, pathonomic finding, or an underlying known pathophysiology, which leaves us sort of acknowledging the reality that we will always, at some level, be a phenomenological specialty. That's also partly the interesting part of it, which is that we're dealing with this incredible complexity that is, what is it to be a person? And most other specialties don't. That said, when we give away illnesses, so like seizures, right? In the early asylum era, like 30% of people who were committed for mental health reasons had epilepsy.
Yeah.
We discover spike and wave. We come up with a pathological theory of seizures. Neurologists get the seizures, but alongside it, they get non-epileptic seizures, pseudo seizures, we used to call them, right? So that invariably, when we give away an illness, it brings with it an illness that probably more appropriately lives with us.
My old mentor at UCSF used to say that psychiatry is a repository of uncertainty. That, to your point, as soon as we understand the etiology of a disease, it goes to neurology.
or gastroenterology,
or gastroenterology,
or the another 30% of those folks in mental health asylums had syphilis, right? And we discovered that is caused by bacteria, and now it's an infectious disease. So,
yep. It's one of those questions I always like to ask my students of, like, what was the most impactful psychiatric medicine and psychiatry in the 20th century? And they all say Thorazine or Prozac or something. I say, no, it's penicillin.
Right. Exactly.
It ended neurosyphilis. So speaking of old drugs, let's talk about the one that you're involved in working on. So Definium, for people that don't know, is working on clinical trials to treat GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, and major depression with a drug which, for all intents and purposes, is LSD.
It is LSD, yeah.
LSD. It has the code name of MM120, which is a common, for people that are less familiar with drug development. Usually drugs, before they go to the FDA for approval, they often have these kind of cryptic code names. But MM120 is LSD. And so, could you tell us about that process and what you're working on and where that's at?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Thorazine, which of course sort of started the modern psychiatric drug era, and LSD was discovered before Thorazine, and its psychedelic properties were discovered before Thorazine was discovered as well. Right. There were a bunch of different angles to think about LSD, why GAD, why MDD, but the couple most straightforward ones are in the first iteration of interest in psychedelics, let's say medical interest in psychedelics or psychiatric interest in psychedelics. LSD was by far the most interesting to researchers at the time. Something like 10 times more papers written and more patients treated with LSD than the rest of the psychedelic category combined. And arguably, Western interest, and I sort of use capital W Western interest in psychedelics, was catalyzed by the discovery of LSD. Yet, in this reiteration of interest in the category, LSD was kind of left out of the early conversation. And there are some reasons for that, right? And there's some sociopolitical and sociocultural reasons for that. LSD picked up a tricky rap, let's say, along the way in the 50s and 60s, and was associated somehow with both sides of a culture war. That both the counterculture and arguably like the warriors of the hegemonic state were both trying to use LSD or using LSD and trying to understand its various properties and potential to change human behavior. And I think that baggage that it picked up along the way, positive and negative baggage, led the folks who were, I think, bravely willing to put reputation and career on the line to be able to restart some of this research. They realized they'd have an easier road, I think, with drugs like psilocybin.
Yeah.
That just had less association with them, negative and positive, of course, but that they didn't carry so much weight. And so in this reiteration of the research, these other drugs got brought to the fore, and LSD was sort of sitting, not being particularly attended to. And this predated my involvement with then MindMed, now Definium, as you pointed out. But I think it was a wise choice to say, well, we're willing to take that risk and go back to this drug that is tremendously potent and that in that early iteration of research showed so much potential. So from a company perspective, an under-attended to drug with such demonstrated potential in the predecessor research was a fairly, I think, obvious choice for the folks who made that choice. And by the time I got involved, we were a ways down the road. The indication choice is another one that I think actually has a similar rationale, which is that if you look at the history of modern psychiatry, if you go back to, I don't know, let's say Kraepelin and Freud, to take the two sides of the 19th century coin, anxiety was recognized as a core symptom and a core cause of distress and disability in a way that even something like the construct of depression wasn't. That the label depression was applied to people who had what today we would call sort of neurovegetative, severe melancholic depression, and everyone else was anxious.
Right.
And it was a change in the late 80s, early 90s, the SRI era, where due to forces both within psychiatry's control and arguably a little bit outside of psychiatry's control, the focus changed from anxiety to depression as the core symptom of interest. And one could make the point that that's because SRIs, the drugs being pushed at the time, work an awful lot better for the anhedonic symptoms of depression than they do for the anxious symptoms of depression. Yeah. And that in a world where GAD and MDD, in their current definitional iteration, their sort of taxonomic iteration, have about an 80% construct overlap.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up seeing television ads that told me that everybody worries, but major depression means you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. And
that's right.
Turns out it was a Zoloft deficiency. Who knew? But
who knew? We should put it in water, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so anxiety was sort of cast to the side. And even in predecessors to DSM-5, DSM-3, GAD was a subordinate diagnosis to MDD, that if you had MDD, you couldn't have GAD. Right. And your inter-episode anxiety was just a component of your MDD. It wasn't GAD as a separate disorder that maybe predated and existed in between major depressive episodes. No, it was all a component of MDD. And so looking at this world where there was, I think, arguably an intentional and artificial elevation of the MDD diagnosis, which is really just defined as having had a major depressive episode, and doesn't take into account that for folks between major depressive episodes, or even folks with what we might call treatment-resistant depression, the resistant symptom cluster and the persistent experience between depressive episodes is often quite anxious. And so to explicitly say, we have this drug with this historical evidence, this enormous potency, and a tremendously different mechanism than the daily drugs that are available today that don't work very well for anxiety. Let's take this shot at GAD, which we recognize is underdiagnosed, is tremendously prevalent in the population, has a huge burden of disease, and we had a reason from the precedent research, and now obviously we've done some of our own research, have reason to believe would be potentially tractable with the drug we're developing.
Yeah. I remember, I think it was Steve Ross or somebody who did one of the early psilocybin studies that was asked, why'd you choose psilocybin? And he said, because it's harder to spell than LSD. That LSD has sort of baggage with it. But I remember when the MindMed studies first launched, and talking to them with colleagues, and these, and the common response was like, LSD for anxiety, like that is a drug that a lot of people associate with feeling anxious. When they phenomenologically, anxiety is not an uncommon experience when people take LSD in kind of uncontrolled settings. And so there's sort of a face validity issue there, where it's like, wow, would that really be effective? And with psilocybin, it seems like there's increasingly a fairly well articulated sort of hypothesis as to how this might work. There's obviously a bunch of different perspectives on that, whether it's sort of entropic brain or decrease experiential avoidance or changing your story or whatever. Do we have a sense of why LSD would move the needle for GAD on a sort of biological level?
Yeah, boy, we have a sense that it does now, having done the phase 2 research that we've done and charged hard into some phase 3 studies. So at some level, demonstration of efficacy often in psychiatry trumps the need for a robust mechanistic understanding of how drugs work. There's so much in what you just said, right? Which is the idea that LSD maybe transiently exacerbates anxiety. And that may be true. Certainly part of the baggage when we talk about LSD are these stories that sort of predate prohibition and probably sort of predicted prohibition or led to prohibition, which is that people under the influence of LSD and its transient effects may have bad times, right? That stereotypical bad trip. Interestingly, and maybe even unexpectedly for us, when we went into this phase 2 study that we did, we also hadn't had experience giving people with anxiety decently high doses of LSD.
Right.
And we were worried about the same things I think anybody else would worry about. We were worried that people would have tough times.
Yeah.
And went into it with a whole armamentarium of potential responses, everything from sort of the social interaction and engagement to some scripted interaction to help people, get out of the cycles that can potentially be anxiety inducing and difficult for folks, all the way through to benzodiazepines. And we even had a sort of a protocol ready with antipsychotics going into that study. Interestingly and very gratifyingly, and obviously, in a good sign for our ability to continue to develop the drug, we didn't see any of that.
Yeah.
We didn't end up falling back on those medicines, and light social interventions ended up being what it took, even when people started to have a not great time, and even that was less frequent than we expected. So something about being in a clinical setting, clinical drug supply, so a high purity drug supply,
Sure.
well-controlled dose, which is difficult with such a high potency drug, led people to just not have the sorts of experiences we were expecting. So much so that in phase 3, while that we still have the ability to administer benzodiazepines, we didn't even really bring forward any sort of an antipsychotic protocol because it's just not an issue.
Yeah.
So that choice uh, took the chance that, yeah, maybe LSD was anxiogenic in a way that other drugs weren't, but just that has not been the experience in the clinical trials, including phase one work, clinical pharmacology work, where we can give even higher doses for a variety of reasons, and we're just not seeing that happen. The other thing, though, is related to mechanism, I suppose, which is that my practice is entirely psychotherapy at this point, and it's pretty limited. I have two patients, so I can talk about my patients, and I don't have to say my patient. But at any given time, um, I think it's important to keep seeing patients when you're in the drug development enterprise. And my lighthearted thing to say is that if you don't keep seeing patients, you start to believe what you read in literature. But that comes back to the measurement problems of psychiatry.
Right.
But you kind of keeps you grounded in a reality that you recognize is really difficult to capture
Yes. Yeah.
in the quantifiable, and even difficult to capture in the sort of the prose that we're able to include in papers, because ultimately, like, all of the ink spilled in all of human literature is an attempt to capture psychiatry. So it's going to be hard to do in a few pages in a journal. But the idea that transient anxiety isn't either an important part of or even potentially necessary to address chronic anxiety, I think kind of misses the therapeutic process, which is
Yeah.
that when we do particularly depth psychotherapy, where we're not attempting to alleviate the feelings that arise during the therapy, but rather potentially to even exacerbate and certainly to explore those feelings, we're used to the idea that feeling something along the way may be the path to having a better understanding of, and ultimately um, not be ruled by the feelings that sort of bubble up from underneath. And so, uh, when it comes to mechanism, and you talked about the potentially the sort of two ends of the spectrum, though, the sort of non-hallucinogenic psychedelic, though arguably all hallucinogenics are all psychedelics are non-hallucinogenic. I've got some phenomenological issues with calling the things that happen while people are under the influence of psychedelics hallucinations, exactly, because they're not exactly that. And we can talk about what they might be.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure what it means to be a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic. It means you're playing with serotonin, but it doesn't have acute effects. We'll
Yeah.
see how that all plays out. I usually put the two ends of the category spectrum at MDMA and ketamine in its ilk, which
Okay.
is that as far as I can tell, based on what we know, an MDMA experience without some sort of dyadic intervention doesn't look like it leads to lasting change. And that dyadic intervention can be person and some sort of therapeutic intervener. Obviously, for folks who've done this in a variety of settings, it can also be two people who are both on MDMA and would like to get along better.
Sure.
So you can see that in couples. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm not convinced that there's much therapeutic utility to dyadic intervention with the ketamine type drugs. That seems to be pretty pure neurobiology, and the experience comes along with that, but isn't mechanistic. Now, I've heard arguments to the contrary, and I could be convinced of those. I think with the right evidence. The classic psychedelics I think of as sitting in the middle of those two,
Uh-huh.
which is that they are almost certainly multimodal in their mechanism. And I am increasingly convinced by what we've seen in the data that a part of that mechanism, and what does efficacy mean? It means you move the scale, but the scale measures a bunch of things. That a part of the mechanism, that items on those scales, or probably more importantly, aspects of how people describe, let's say, in anxiety, the relationship to the future, right, which is really where anxiety lives, have a dependency on that transient experience. That things that happen during that experience are a component of the. Somebody wants to join the stream here, or a component of that mechanism. There are almost certainly parts of the efficacy that aren't mediated by those transient effects and have some mechanistic cause in other aspects of the neurobiology of the drugs. And at the end of all this, that's kind of a long way of saying that in a world where our diseases are not mechanistically defined and we are not ever going to find some single unitary underlying biology of either GAD or MDD, or let's say big picture anxiety and depression. They're almost certainly multimodal illnesses and are different in different people. Drugs like MM120 or DT120, as our new lab code that we're not going to hit too hard, but lysergide tartrate, that multimodal mechanism leads to these sorts of effect sizes that we've been able to see in the research, in part because in different people with this multimodal underlying, let's say, pathophysiology, for lack of a better word, but it also includes psychology, having a multimodal mechanism of treatment helps more people and helps more people more.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, remember 15, 20 years ago, the thing in pharmacology was specificity, right? And the way that, the sort of marketing of something like escitalopram was that, you compare it to like a tricyclic and say, oh, a tricyclic's a dirty drug. It hits all these other receptors, but then you look at drugs that are incredibly efficacious in psychiatry, like Clozaril. It hits everything. LSD hits a lot of things. It's not just serotonin 2A, obviously. It's a lot of other receptors. And so from just a receptor pharmacology standpoint, what you're saying makes sense. But if I'm understanding you correctly, you're also talking about this sort of phenomenological experience of it that maybe you need to feel anxious during the experience to feel less anxious afterwards.
I think you're understanding me as well as one could understand what I'm saying, which ends up being a little, it ends up sounding a little confused because we end up necessarily sort of talking about neurobiological mechanisms and psychological mechanisms from as if they're two different things.
Right.
Yet I would imagine that most of the folks, and thanks for being here, people. I know it's late on the East Coast. It's a little late here, and so if the fact that you're here and listening really, it means a ton to us. I know,
Yeah.
or bother to have these conversations, but obviously the potential of what we're talking about is what motivates folks to come to lectures and sign on to websites and things like this. But most folks involved in what we do tend to be philosophically monists, right? We tend to think that the mind and the brain are pretty much entirely overlapping, and that the parts of the mind that we value and our psychologies come from neurobiology. And we also kind of have to recognize that we're able to modify our neurobiology through thinking, through the act of trying to think, and through things like psychotherapy, where we think in a very particular way with a particular aim. So when we start to talk about mechanisms of drugs that have these really distinctive transient psychological effects, and then we say, oh, and they also have neurobiological effects. Well, of course, those transient psychological effects are mediated directly by neurobiology, but then they also are mediated through psychology and mediated through people's reaction to them and their experience of them, which arguably is also neurobiology. But I think it's okay to talk about psychological mechanisms and neurobiological mechanisms as if they're different, because in reality, even if we accept that it's all in the brain, it's all in the substance of the brain, it's in the chemicals and the wiring of the brain and all this, our ways of interrogating that system are actually bifurcated. We have neurobiological ways of interrogating the system and psychological ways of interrogating the system, and those two haven't met up all that well to date. And so that, I think, leads us to both necessarily and quite properly talk about them from those two angles, while still acknowledging that they're the same stuff. Arguably, an SRI, a highly precise SRI, which we still don't know how they work. Of course, we call them serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but and they do that, but they start doing that 20 minutes after you take the first dose. And we don't really know what's happening in the 6 weeks it takes before they reduce your depression. And that's 35 years of prescribing them later. But they arguably don't really have a psychological mechanism, right? Unless you consider the doctor or the nurse who prescribed them and gives them and says, I really hope this will help you. And I've seen it help people like you, and that makes it work better. But
Yeah,
that,
it
we
does.
discount that in research because placebo is bad in research and great in practice. Um,
It's your
but
best
the,
friend in practice.
well, it turns out it's the best drug in research too, which is why so many trials fail. But it's the best drug for the most things, right? But at the end of the day, I think the distinctness of the transient effects of these drugs, of the psychological effects of these drugs, makes it worthwhile to consider that there is this transient psychological mechanism and a likely non-detectable, non-psychological neurobiological mechanism.
Yeah, so it's a both and. Yeah, and for people that are maybe not working in psychiatry, maybe it's worth pointing out that a lot of evidence-based treatments for anxiety involve invoking your anxiety as a means of helping to extinguish it. So, probably the most well-known for this is exposure therapy, which to a lot of people sounds awful and terrifying, and they're not interested in it. It's hard. It's a very hard thing to sell as a clinician. I worked at the VA for a number of years, and a lot of people at the first point of conversation around that just shut down that idea that you would intentionally evoke anxiety in order to overcome your anxiety. But there may be an element of all psychedelics that has this experience. It overcomes experiential avoidance, right? The thing that you don't want to feel, psychedelics have this funny way of making you feel it. And that container that you described, it sort of indicates that it can be done without having to, that it's maybe not as bad as people imagine it's going to be, and that they can navigate that successfully.
Yeah. There's an element too, I think, and you alluded to this before, that the thought processes that people have while they're transiently in this psychedelic state likely leads to some retelling of one's self story.
Uh-huh.
And, I said before that I don't really think that the drugs we call hallucinogens are hallucinogenic, and we've stopped calling them hallucinogens on our end and use the psychedelic nomenclature instead. But the thing that it seems like happens, and this is consistent across neurobiological and psychological interrogation, which is that from probably intrauterine experience on, the brain's main learning, that this sort of learning process that happens from a pre-infancy through infancy and early childhood, and of course in many ways continues quite some time into adulthood, is organizing the world, right? That we learn auditory organization probably first and things, and then some visual organization comes online. But ultimately, to my sort of philosophical orientation, psychological, psychiatric orientation, I don't know what we want to call it, but the last thing to come online is linguistics, right? That we learn a linguistic organization of the world. And so when we think about things like ego
Yeah.
or anxiety, these are just stories we tell ourselves, about the future, about the risks and opportunities of the future.
Right.
And when we give people drugs of this category, and this is something they have in common, even though they're not the same, right? The differences between, say, LSD and psilocybin seem to be far greater than the differences between, I don't know, Seroquel and Risperdal, right? That both in terms of potency and in terms of the actually transient experience and all this. So, but what the category does seem to have in common is that the organizational systems seem to come either all the way offline or at least be turned down.
Yeah.
And so what people experience visually and auditorily and with LSD, this sort of concept of synesthesia, that senses cross over, uh, seems to be that organizing system turning down or off. So
Yeah.
people aren't having sort of de novo complex hallucinations the way you might see visually with, say, DTs or something like this, or auditory hallucinations that you might see with schizophrenia. Rather, it's an experience of the world without that organization that really tells us how to not see stuff,
Right.
right? When you look around the world, mostly what your brain is doing is helping you to not see a lot of what's there. And along with the perceptual organization, linguistic organization seems to come offline. So
Yeah.
all of the things we learned about labeling the world that we do constantly without noticing we're doing it, labeling ourselves, labeling, and adding day-to-day activity to our self-story. And the thing that all these experiences have in common, which is the sort of a funny paradox, which is ineffable, right?
Right.
What's the experience like? Well, the first thing I have to say about it is I can't describe it
Yep.
adequately, and then I think is largely because of that linguistic loss of organization. So, in part, the psychological mechanism, let's say, having caveated that with the first, I don't know, 35 minutes of this conversation, is that the usual way of experiencing the self through a story one tells about oneself goes away in the transient experience, and one's left experiencing oneself without that story. This arguably is ego dissolution. And on fMRIs and EEGs, we were able to see this as sort of what is called in those settings the default mode network, like what the brain is doing when it's not trying to do anything.
Right.
And so that all seems pretty consistent to me.
I want to go back to something you said. There's a couple of threads I want to pull on here. One was around the issue of placebo effects, and there was this very important part of the conversation that happened around the Lycos uh, hearing, from the FDA, was this question of functional unblinding. And you guys did something very interesting with the dose stratification study and how that unblinded. So for people that are unfamiliar with functional unblinding, this is that don't you kind of know if you got a placebo or a psychedelic problem? And you guys did something really interesting about this. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that and what that sort of can be, how we can use that understanding in the field as we study these things going forward.
Yeah, there's so much to say about blinding and research methodology and why we went the route we did. Um, I would I would ask that folks, when they hear about or think about or talk about functional unblinding, to ask a couple of questions, and those are who and to what effect. And so there is a very real thing that when you give someone a psychedelic at a treatment dose, they can pretty reliably assess that they were given the drug.
Yeah.
We did a dose range finding study where we gave placebo, 25 micrograms, 50, 100, and 200 micrograms.
Yeah.
And people who got drug reliably knew they got drug, particularly at 50 and higher. People who got placebo, about 70% were able to know that they got placebo. 30% thought they got drug. That's in part because we had these lower doses of drug that could confound someone's belief about whether they got drug.
So just to clarify, so people knew they were either going to get placebo, 25 micrograms, or 50 micrograms, or 100 micrograms, or 200 micrograms. So they could get any one of those 5 doses.
That's right.
And then you said afterwards, what do you think you got? You got drug or placebo? And even the people on the very low doses, 25, 50 micrograms, they pretty reliably said, I think I got drug, right?
Yeah, more reliably the higher the dose, but we're talking 80, 90+% across the dose arms. The placebo, again, 70% accurately assessed they were on placebo, about 30% thought they might have gotten drug. And despite that, so an unblinding is binary, right? Unblinding is you accurately assess you got drug.
Yep.
That's, arguably you're functionally unblinded as a patient. Despite that, we saw a true dose response. So what we set out to measure was, is there a threshold dose for efficacy, and then does efficacy increase with dose level? And we saw dose response that despite unblinding of the patient, people at 100 and 200 had robust clinical efficacy, and not at 25 and 50, despite thinking and knowing that they got drug, which gives us a lot of. The other thing in there is that the placebo arm showed a really robust placebo effect. Arguably, functional unblinding ought to suppress a placebo effect, right? If 70% of people knew they didn't get drug, they ought to not respond if the cause is unblinding.
Right.
So that combination of good robust placebo effect, really robustly exceeded at the higher doses, gave us confidence that it wasn't knowledge of allocation or presumption of allocation on the part of the patients that led to the measured drug effect. We do some other things to protect against unblinding. So nobody who's in the room does efficacy assessments. So, we have dosing session monitors in the room. They don't do the efficacy assessments
Okay.
because they could be unblinded, and we want unbiased efficacy assessments.
Right.
The primary efficacy assessments are done remotely, both in our phase 2 that is published and the phase 3 is happening now. And that's to further protect primary efficacy assessments from any unblinding that could happen at the site level. And those folks are even blinded to visit, right? So that they don't know if this is someone's baseline or 12 months later or what. So, and we actually published a poster on the preservation of blinding among those central raters and discovered that it's very well preserved. So that in the course of conducting, say, a HAM-A, Hamilton Anxiety Scale, or a MADRS, Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, the central raters don't become unblinded as to the patient's either allocation or visit number.
So for people that aren't as in the weeds with running clinical trials, just to unpack this in more plain language, a central rater is somebody who's not involved in the study. You get a phone, you're the subject in the study, you get a phone call, and this person who doesn't know who you are other than your code number in the study, doesn't know if you got drug or a placebo, doesn't know anything about your life, just asks you these questions and you answer them as best you can. And so that prevents that rater from thinking like, well, I think they got drugs, so they're probably doing better. Right.
Or but conscious or unconscious or whatever.
Right.
It just takes those biases out of it. So from the perspective of we have these competing interests, which of course are to try to mitigate placebo response and mitigate functional unblinding, and those are countervailing trial method interests. But across the board, the ultimate goal is to try to demonstrate. What do we do in research? We set up a contrived scenario and try to control for variance across the population, randomize people into groups, and as much as possible try to make the difference between the groups, intervention or non-intervention. And so we've set up the entire program, phase 2 through to phase 3 for both GAD and MDD, to demonstrate that the effect we're able to measure in these studies represents a real drug effect. Right. At the end of the day, that's the point of the research. And so we have different designs from phase 2 to phase 3. Phase 2, we had the dose range finding. In our phase 3 studies for each indication, we have almost entirely the same design as the phase 2, with fewer arms. And so we'll have one GAD phase 3 that has 2 arms, just 100 micrograms versus placebo. One that has a lower enrolling intermediate arm, a 50 microgram dose arm, not because we're interested in what 50 micrograms does. We already established that it's not the dose we want to bring forward, and it's not an effective treatment dose in phase 2, but because that 50 microgram arm creates a point of confounding for people who got 100 or 0. And makes people less likely to sort of estimate that they got the treatment dose or not. And ultimately, what we'd like to see is about the same drug effect across these different conditions.
Right. So the really take-home message from what I'm hearing is that what you guys demonstrated was that just knowing that you got the drug wasn't enough to make you better.
That's right.
You have to have enough of the drug in order to see a clinical effect. Now that's really important because a lot of these earlier studies didn't do that. And then the obvious critique is, well, yeah, you had expectancy effects because you felt the drug effects and you said, I got the goods, right? I'm going to get better because I've heard so many good things about this drug. Let's pivot in the time we've got left here, because I know the folks watching this are going to be interested in how these studies are actually delivered, because there's this big question in the psychedelic space about the sort of the dose, the setting, how this is delivered, and if you will, sort of the dose of therapy, if there's therapy involved at all, and who's delivering that therapy. And so we've got on the very enriched range, you've got like the MAPS type study, 48 hours of therapy, something like that, 2 clinicians. And then on the other, I think you've got like Delix, which is this sort of non-psychedelic psychoplastogen type of drug that doesn't have subjective psychedelic effects and presumably won't need any monitoring. It can be just taken at home. You guys are kind of in the middle. Can you speak to how you actually deliver this and what it looks like if I'm a subject of your studies?
Absolutely, and one of the more interesting topics I think in the category is what do you do before, during, and after someone gets a drug that has this set of distinct transient effects. We from the outset set out to demonstrate as much as possible standalone drug effect. That I'm obviously a big believer in psychotherapy. I think psychotherapy is a wonderful intervention when delivered well. It obviously takes time and effort from highly skilled practitioners to be able to deliver, effective psychotherapy. So, in no way do we have an anti-psychotherapy bias or stance. But as drug developers, we absolutely have a isolate to as few variables as possible
Right.
stance. And so what we did in phase 2 and continue to do in phase 3 is not have a dyadic intervention intended to move the needle on the efficacy or on the disease state at all. So we do think that people who are on a real treatment dose of lysergide of DT120, MM120, should be monitored, and they should have someone there to help them if they need help. Mostly what folks need help with is going to the bathroom and getting a snack. Sometimes people certainly need help being reminded that they're on a drug that has these pretty profound potential effects, and here are some things you might do if that becomes uncomfortable or intolerable. But the goal of the person or people in the room is never to move the disease in any way.
Okay.
So there are not interpretive interventions. There's not sort of guiding people through the experience. It's as reduced to safety and assistance as we're able to do. This has led to a lot of questions. Arguably, how do you know people aren't accidentally doing psychotherapy? I mean, or on purpose, or violating the protocol and doing it. We do quite a bit to both help the folks who are going to be in the room understand where the boundaries should be and ought to be, and we monitor everybody with either two people in the room or one person in the room, one person watching remotely by video. So there's this sort of fidelity to the protocol monitoring from a second person. I don't think people accidentally do psychotherapy. I hope, that I'm a psychotherapist myself. I think I would get invited to even fewer dinner parties than I do if I was constantly accidentally doing psychotherapy. Um, the
How do you feel about that, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. How does that make me feel? I don't know. Calm. The but I think we are able to, based on the evidence we've accumulated through phase 2, and we're doing more in phase 3, to say that the effect we observe from the drug is not dependent on some sort of dyadic intervention. It's not dependent on people being told what to we obviously tell people what to expect from an informed consent perspective, just as you would with a second generation antipsychotic or an SRI or any other class of drugs you're researching. People need to know what they're possibly going to experience, possibly not, of course, because
Right.
half to a third of folks are not going to get drug in their first in their first dose. And then in the period and during drug dosing, people are largely there for assistance. We found that the participants in our studies largely appreciate that and want to have an internal experience and don't really want to be bothered or interfered with. We have to do some of that to check for adverse events in research that you probably wouldn't have to do in clinical care. We've got to check vitals periodically, things like that. And then afterward, there's no attempt to recapitulate or connect the experience to life moving forward. People may or may not do that on their own, but our dosing session monitors don't do that. What we do is make the dosing session monitor available in a post-dose session if the participant has questions. They don't fully remember something that happened or something they said or how long, whatever. We certainly allow the DSMs to answer questions the participant might have about their session, but not in an interpretive way, and not in a way that's that either uses a psychotherapeutic technique or is intended to lead to change.
So this is a very light touch compared to a lot of historic psychedelic assisted therapy, where you've got this sort of you've got the informed consent part that you described, but you've also got this big kind of autobiographical gathering of like, tell me about your life, tell me about what you're working on, tell me about what you think might come up in this. And then afterwards we say, what came up for you? How do you want to work that into your life? You're not doing a whole lot of that.
Well,
That's
no, we're really not. I mean, we get history in as much as it is useful for clinical trial reasons and diagnostic reasons, but that's not the DSM gathering those data.
okay.
So it's really not. It's not a psychotherapeutic intervention. The dosing session monitors are not a contributory piece of the mechanism as best we're able to make them not one.
Yeah. So DSM, the dosing session monitor, different DSM. Yeah.
That's right. We were co-opting the DSM terminology. From now on it's dosing session monitors. Sorry.
DSM-6, right? Yes. So, well, that brings a relevant question for this audience, which is, in psychedelics, historically, nursing has, it's interesting because there's an interesting footnote you probably know about of there's a nurse who just died last year at 102 who worked with Humphrey Osmond in Canada in the 1960s named Kay Parley. I went and interviewed her right before her 101st birthday, and she was giving LSD to people with alcohol use disorder back then, and there was a lot of quiet sitting. She wrote this beautiful piece in the American Journal of Nursing, and so a lot of our audience originally was feeling kind of like they weren't going to be a part of this because you had these very skilled psychotherapists or psychiatrists who are doing these settings. And what I'm hearing now is that you've kind of gone to a different model where you've really just got somebody there to ensure safety and integrity of the study, and that really the person undergoing the treatment is sort of allowed to have their own experience internally.
Yeah,
Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and I think what you're sort of stepping maybe gently toward or around is that this means that the range of professionals who can participate in this is pretty enormous. That we don't need people who practice psychotherapy outside of the room to be in the room. And I think that well, and obviously, but nurses who prescribe, advanced practice nurses, are going to be a huge part of the prescribing world of this drug and these drugs if and when they get approved. But the comfort to do less, I think, is something that, in my experience, many of the non-prescribing nurses I've worked with are actually the people who are best at that in hospital settings and outside of hospital settings, of sitting and saying, no, this is not the time to intervene.
Yeah.
And so I think that particular skill set and the model that we're developing is going to be extraordinarily relevant for that DSM role.
Yeah.
And that they're, I mean, in part, obviously for scientific fidelity, we went down this road and developed these methods, but always with an eye toward, if we're able to move this drug toward approval, having a big tent and being sure that in a world where availability of treatment, particularly psychiatric treatment, is so much more limited than the need, being able to harness the strengths of a variety of professionals who provide all sorts of different care and care roles. This opens the door to that. Yeah. And it opens the door to, I think, a rational reconsideration of who does what in care associated with the category.
Yeah. No, that's really encouraging to hear. And I think from one of the other big questions in the space is, how do we get this to all the people that are going to need it? Because there's something like 5 million potential people that could benefit from psychedelics for depression alone. And I don't even know what the numbers are for GAD. And so in order to get that to people at scale, you have to have a wide range of people who can deliver this treatment. And, we have 5 million of us in nursing in this country alone. So that's a pretty big labor pool, if not the largest, health profession labor pool. So that makes sense. And your point about sometimes what I found in training psychedelic clinicians is you often have to untrain them from what especially if you've been kind of conditioned to be an interventionist, and you're always, and I do this, when I'm seeing patients for medication management, I'm thinking, well, what haven't we tried? what can we do next? And I know psychologist friends that are always like, what evidence-based treatment can I pull out of my bag to deploy on this problem right now? And psychedelics seem to invite this invitation to pause, be like, maybe it's not about doing a thing right now. Maybe it's about letting this unfold. And that seems to be at the heart of your model.
I think that's right. Being able to be there if needed, but not jump in, but not intervene, not and I think that sort of reflexive action, reflex to act, uh, kicks in the most when we have the most doubt about what's happening in front of us. That we always sort of in the practice of depth psychotherapy, if you find yourself explaining, this is probably countertransferential and you've encountered some discomfort in yourself.
Right.
And so the comfort and we'll see how all this plays out if approved when we're able to treat people in the real world. I think as psychiatric, psychological, and all of the professionals who have to engage with psychology, which arguably is all of the professionals, see that they can really make a difference in people's lives fairly efficiently in a way that they couldn't really contemplate before, that reflex to act will probably go down a bit. And there'll be increased comfort with sitting and letting things play out in a way that doesn't require explanation or intervention.
Yeah, my residents will tell you that I often tell them, in psychiatry, we're always treating anxiety, and every once in a while, it's actually the patients. And this is a great example. In psychedelic sessions, sometimes you're thinking, oh man, this person's like really upset, or they're crying, or they're restless, whatever. I have to do something. It's like, maybe not. Maybe just check. Put your own oxygen mask on first, and then see maybe if they don't need. Do they need help still?
This is it. This is
Yeah.
the trick to inaction.
Yeah, Kaki Schwartz, who you may know from your Boulder site or Denver site, she's worked. I think she's worked on some of your trials. Remind us of that great acronym of WAIT. Why am I talking? So there you go. Or why am I touching?
There it is. Yeah.
That tricky question around touch in psychedelics. Are there any particular skills you think a nurse who's watching this, who's just getting interested in psychedelics, might benefit from knowing about or learning from or experiencing?
I mean, I think that the core skills of nursing are quite relevant and really kind of that sort of interpersonal presence, the calmness, the experience with just being in the room with people while they go through whatever is incredibly helpful. We train our DSMs, but it's a training that really is a matter of hours, not days or weeks or months, because again, what we're doing is falling back on people's intrinsic or learned, I guess, ability to have enough rapport to be in the room and make sure someone feels comfortable. That if something were, it's less about when something happens, what to do, and more about the participant in our case, but eventually the patient, knowing if something were to happen, this person's got me, and then something doesn't need to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the last few minutes we have here, can you give us a little sneak preview of what's coming out from Definium in the next year or so? Because you're coming to the end of some phase 3 studies, right?
That's right. Well, for everyone who waited this long, here's the headline. None of this is news. If you look at our website, all this stuff is there and on the corporate deck. But 3 phase 3 studies are running now, 2 in GAD. These are the studies that we will ultimately use to go to FDA and seek approval. We have 1 GAD study that will read out in the first half of now this year. I'm going to say next year, but it's now this year. 1 GAD study that will read out in the second half of next year, and an MDD study that will read out in the middle of next year. So we've got those 3 coming. We've got a 4th MDD study planned to start right on the heels of the wrap up of the first MDD study. So 3 studies worth of data coming this year.
Wow.
Which will be obviously those studies then become the material that allows us to, those combined with a bunch of other work, both in animals and in healthy volunteers, allow us to go to FDA with an application for approval.
Fantastic. And a readout for people that are not familiar that's not a journal publication necessarily. That's a hey, we have some new data, right?
I will strive to make them journal publications as quickly as possible, though. I mean, it's, as you know better than I do, publishing in this space, people have a lot of things to say about those articles. So by the time they hit the press, they're usually pretty well reviewed, extensively reviewed and revised. But yeah, we'll announce what we call top line readout on those timelines that I just gave, which is the big endpoint measures, so the primary endpoint and the key secondaries, along with some demographics and things so you can understand who we treated in the study and what happened to them, and then we follow that up as quickly as we're able with full reports in journals.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it's I think for a lot of people who maybe kind of dozed through research methods, suddenly those things become very interesting when you're passionate about a particular area.
if nothing else, thus far, the psychedelic renaissance has brought a lot of people into reading science in a way they probably wouldn't have before, and that's great. I mean, it's what I said is we were heading into phase 2 and coming out of phase 2 is very rarely in my prior experience, never in my prior experience with developing psychiatric drugs did we have popular press covering phase 2 study starts and things like this. So the attention on the drugs is great, and I think everyone should be measured in our exuberance, but also the amount of optimism I hear coming from all of the different angles in psychiatry and just the hope for this sort of change that this can induce in clinical practice and ultimately induce that change in patients is really strong, and I think the evidence that we're gathering now and others will just be able to continue to rationally and scientifically feed into that enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. We often end our conversations with this little traditional ending, and if you would be open to answer it, we'd like to ask all our guests on this show, if you could go back and give yourself a little bit of advice, to your younger self, what would it be?
Probably something like, nobody notices you as much as you do.
Oh man, isn't that the truth? Well, that's very relevant for an anxiety study. I think if my 15-year-old self could have understood that, I would have been a much happier 15-year-old, as probably many of us would have been.
Probably worthwhile remembering tomorrow too.
Indeed.
Today is just your younger self for tomorrow.
I love that. And the website for the company is
DefiniumTX.com. DefiniumTX.com.
DefiniumTX.com. And we'll put that in the notes for when we put this up on YouTube. We had a little bit of a technical problem with the stream, but we'll get it up on YouTube later. So
sounds great.
Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. We really do appreciate it. And this is a fantastic perspective, and I think will be very appreciated by all the folks who are watching it tonight and also in the future. So appreciate it.
My pleasure in getting to be with audiences of professionals who honestly we don't usually have this kind of ability to connect with means the world to us. So as we move forward and see the things that we'll see with these readouts, but always happy to come back and try to contextualize and talk about things more because there's clearly a lot of interest here.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to do that, Dan. Great. Thank you so much. Have a good night out there in New York. I know it's kind of late, so appreciate it.
Have a great night.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye-bye.